Okay, well, thank you to Victoria for that introduction, and we're really pleased to be here to be able to present this piece of work with you today. It's very much a fresh piece of work that's currently undergoing a round of review, so it may look slightly different by the time it's finally out in the world. But yeah, we just wanted to share with you today our development of what we've called arboreal methodologies in early childhood education and what they make possible. Um, so yeah, it will become clear as the presentation unfolds what we consider this to be and how they've come about and what we hope they make possible. Um, but this is the citational reference to the chapter when it comes out, and kind of briefly put arboreal methodologies in childhood research. What we're seeking to do is to bring embodied encounters in the forest together with tales of the forest as commercial enterprise, and also turn attention to the recent growth of the forest school movement. And in order to do this, we have to pursue critical, tentacular engagements with the forest in inverted commas, as a contested site and a contested manifestation. And we take seriously the forest's potential to agitate familiarity and strangeness, wonder and fear, nature and culture. So what we found through this experimentation over many, many months is that arboreal methodologies are lively, unfurling, interwoven, and often uncertain. So it's from the forest floor in Moomin Valley, which we'll go on to explain a little bit in a second, to the thin green line of North London, to a Swedish forest near Suzanne's summer house in Sweden. We re-encounter embodied becomings with the forest to think and sense other ways to take life in what Anna Zing terms the plantationocene seriously. So our inquiry involves walking, talking, storytelling, art making, and a slow, deep exploration of the temporalities, textures, and complexities of what Peter Wolben terms tree time. Okay, so as I've just mentioned there, the Moomins are kind of central to our investigation, and they provided us with the inspiration for this project at the outset, thinking how we could seriously play with children's literature to get at the mysterious and the not known and the not yet known. So we read, our methodologies are read through Janssen's fantasy world of Moomin Valley. And this activates a diffractive engagement with the known, not known, and not yet known that the contours of the forest provide. And as many of the audience will know, and anyone who loves children's literature, it offers an effective economy of speculation, adventure, fantasy, fear, danger, and destruction, and provides a generative space from which to immerse in, escape, and divert attention from the political realities of life in the Anthropocene. But what our praxis, that is our arboreal methodologies, seeks to do is to explore the generative possibilities presented by Moomin Valley to grapple with the problematics of capitalist logic, capitalist ruins, and kinship, as Anna Zing and colleagues term them, and what that might mean for reimagining the child. So children's literature has long attended to the sinister, the monstrous, and the fantastical. And we find Janssen's fixation with the forest really helpful, since it generates one means by which we might pursue the discomforts of the forest and what that might make possible in childhood research. So taking Janssen as inspiration, we think the forest can be understood as exercising agency. It can be understood as a collaboration, a confederate series of never-ending assemblages. The forest shapes bodily encounters. Within the Moomin tales, the forest becomes subject. It is acknowledged as more than mere context or location, as it exercises what Jane Bennett terms vital materialism. So the work of Chimera and Simard contributes further to this conceptualization of the forest and the urgent need for humans to embrace a willingness to regard ourselves as little more than a forest microbe, with the responsibility to become with, in symbiosis, in pursuit of what Haraway terms worldly justice. We view arboreal methodologies as a form of dwelling, a form of learning with and from the forest. As early childhood scholars, we work with what we know, or at least we thought we knew, and open ourselves to ruptures and surprises. With the help of feminist new materialist and indigenous ethico-onto epistemologies, we offer small stories that draw into focus a concern with what else pedagogy, research, and activism might become through world-making practices shaped by curiosity and a willingness to get our hands dirty in the pursuit of finding other ways to experience our place within the world. Arboreal methodologies can be understood as a modality that enables a deep exploration of the apparently humdrum ordinariness that is so often taken for granted in childhood studies. Like others, we resist the conflation of childhood with nature and instead directly challenge romanticised ideas that both are times and spaces of innocence and purity. As Donna Haraway has argued, nature and culture are inseparable. The liveliness of capitalism throbs and emerges throughout the forest. Children of the Anthropocene are not spared the realities of capitalism by immersing in nature. All humans, children included, are interwoven and entangled in endlessly unfolding discomforts of late capitalism. Following Anna Zing, we attend to multi-species flourishing on a damaged planet by noticing the non-innocence of the forest in all its gory splendour. Isabel Stengers offers an ecology of practices as collaboration shaped by divergent attachments and belongings. Coming together, collaborating is always from somewhere, and we need to be able to bring something back to the communities that we belong to and go back to. And these communities are always more and other than human. So arboreal methodologies, and here we're not just talking about research, we're thinking about activism, writing and living practices, require careful attention to what and how knowledge is generated. And it's based upon ontologies that refuse Western positivist ways of knowing. Feminist New Materialism shares many objectives in the creation of knowledge and being in the world with indigenous ontologies. Both privilege locally embedded stories, materially and discursively entangled practices, and both approaches celebrate relationality, reciprocity, collaboration, and queer multi-species kinship and the interconnected nature of values. So, as argued by Hannah Guttorm and colleagues, indigenous ontologies and Western critical theories can work well together in challenging traditional Western power knowledge systems, as well as institutional and disciplinary orthodoxies. Feminist, new materialist and indigenous ways of knowing being hold the potential to undo or disrupt scientific practices. This requires creating new and alternative spaces to knowing and writing. So what we're attempting to do with our arboreal methodologies is very much a modest attempt at developing ways to contribute to that broader project that they describe and resisting what Haraway terms the God trick through practices of mutated modest witnessing, which I've written about elsewhere. So as white scholars located in the global north, we recognise the imperative to exercise care and caution in our conscious refusal to engage in practices of appropriation or colonising ancient ways of being, belonging and becoming. Our aim is to explore the potential that exists in the synergies and the distinctions. We celebrate the shared commitment that feminist new materialism and indigenous ontologies have to generating knowledge differently by playing seriously with ways to disrupt the hegemony of certain ways of knowing. It's by experimenting with and incorporating other modalities of knowledge and dissemination, such as storytelling, poetry, and artworks, which we'll share with you throughout this presentation, and we do in the chapter. We feel it's possible to present a direct challenge to the Western canon and what counts as valid knowledge, to follow Patty Lather. So we turn to storytellers to help us in the pursuit of finding other ways to generate knowledge and to be in the world. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a mother. She's a scientist, an esteemed professor, and a member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation. Her work unites and contrasts rich and beautiful stories of Indigenous knowledge about plants with scientific perspectives. Her interwoven stories are of reciprocity, pain, connection, heritage, and colonialism. She notes that plants have been on the earth far longer than we have and have had time to figure things out. They live both above and below ground, joining sky world to earth. Plants know how to make food and medicine from light and water, and they give it away. Her storytelling directly challenges the long-held scientific view that plants and trees are passive. She tells a tale of reciprocity. Gratitude, nurturance, and embracing our living environments are the cornerstones of her story, which underline our larger, deeper, symbiotic connection to the earth. The ability for plants and trees to communicate has been known for millennia, but it is only very recently that they've been acknowledged by forestry studies, not least the work of Susan Simard. Kimmerer appears comforted that science is finally catching up all these hundreds of years later. Plants have enjoyed multi-species flourishing long before humans arrived on the scene. She describes the relationship between human animals and plants as being one based on a gift economy. Key to this is restoring what she terms the grammar of animacy. This means viewing nature not as a resource, but rather as an elder relative, and to recognise kinship with plants, mountains, and lakes. Susan Simard is another storyteller that we turn to for inspiration. Although her story is caught up and stymied by Western scientific discourse in ways that differ from Kimmerer's tale, it is no less useful to the pursuit of the development of an arboreal methodology. In her recent book, Finding the Mother Tree, we learn that this professor of forestry, science educator and environmental activist has always had a deep fascination with trees. A detailed and intricate story of a female scientist on a journey of research exploration is recounted, starting in childhood with an adventurous girl growing up in Canada within a logging family. She goes on to become a fearless field scientist challenging government policy, and ultimately an esteemed professor fighting a personal battle with cancer and finding strength from resilience and interdependence of trees. Simard is perhaps best known for her discovery of tree interdependence via networks of symbiotic fungi that connect with plant roots, which has been termed the wood wide web. Of course, this discovery is eerily similar to Kimmerer's accounts of indigenous knowledges about kinship connections among plants and trees. For Simard, bringing this knowledge to the scientific world was met with hostility and disbelief. As a female scientist whose research contradicted official forestry policies, her work was marginalised and mocked. So there is hope, we think, to be found in working with the ideas presented by these two storytelling female academics. Their impassioned accounts of how forests work, how trees, spirits, forces, fungi, and mycorrhizal networks come together as a direct challenge to received wisdom about how we are encouraged to think about vegetal matter. So contemplating the work of these scholars insists that we cannot accept plants as in any sense inanimate. We must take seriously our relationalities, responsibilities, and indebtedness to billions of years of complex plant evolution and ecology. And maybe this just makes us think slightly differently about things that we recognise in a very familiar way, such as the forest school. And I'll just hand over to Suzanne here.
The forest school movement has grown exponentially in the recent past. It is firmly underpinned by ideas and value of nature to healthy child development. However, we wonder whether taking the above accounts of how forests function, evolve, and collaborate could offer other potentially richer ways in which humans might encounter the forest from an altogether different starting place, committed to decentering the human. The rich knowledge, insight, and attunement to ancestral and ancient forces of the natural world offered by Kimmerer and Simard could usefully offer a means to confront the colonization of woodland for narrow anthropocentric purposes, from disposal to make way for train lines and roads, to forestry for wood manufacturing, through to its usefulness as a resource for early childhood education. The origins of the forest school movement can be traced to Scandinavian outdoor living from the 1950s, which evolved into nature pedagogies in the 1980s and found expression in the early years philosophy in the United Kingdom around that time. Here in Sweden, it's called EU out, so come all weathers, in rain or shine. There is a long history of valuing the outdoors as a place where children can play and develop, detectable in the words of Froebel and Macmillan, among others. But across Scandinavia, research has established the value of being in the outdoors for young children. Children free to develop in the nature-rich environments of the forest schools with few pressures were less stressed, more confident, especially in taking calculated risks. They had better communication skills, were more creative, showed better emotional well-being, suffered less ill health, and had better concentration on entering formal education. The opportunity to be active and learn through movement with all the senses reduced stress. Forest settings also enhanced children's creativity and improved communication skills. Other observed benefits included the reduced likelihood of viruses and germs being shared in the outdoors, and the reduced prospect of childhood obesity due to the increased physical activity. Exponents of the forest school movement claim that it is altogether healthier environment and helps children appreciate a world where they ultimately care for. According to Louvre, children forced to stay indoors can suffer from nature deficit syndrome because they are not in touch with the natural world and the rhythms of nature. The emphasis of the forest school movement is squarely on what nature can do for humans, where the forest is conceived as a resource, a context, or a provider. Viewing it in this way amounts to human exceptionalism that unwittingly reinscribes both extractivism and consumerism. Leather critiques the forest school movement in the UK for adopting a Scandinavian model that fails to adequately navigate cultural differences, that it rests upon the under-theorization and the rapid institutionalization and commodification of forest school practices, has taken a sinister corporate turn, which is often used as a little more than a descriptor that appeals to fee-paying parents wanting a closer to nature experience for their children. Tangential industries, for example, outdoor clothing companies that might have dubious eco credentials, so not always as eco-friendly as you think, are intricately and although unwittingly entangled with the forest school movement, making it a lucrative market-driven economy in early childhood. Therefore, the forest school movement cannot be considered distinct and separate from the wider world. Mapping the non-innocence of matter, such as waterproof puddle suits or the plastic welly boot, necessary to attend forest school would likely reveal a complex and altogether disturbing and unsettling counter-narrative that's simply the conflation of childhood with nature. Romanticized accounts of childhood and its relationship to the purity of nature are fictions.
I think that's all really crucial stuff because it's so embedded in the way that we think about the forest school as being inherently good and nature as being inherently pure and children benefiting developmentally and physically and mentally from being in nature. but actually there's this kind of sinister underbelly that we need to engage with, and I think that's what our arboreal methods are working towards. So if we study a map of the country, what we can find is that woodland has often been carved up, often to make way for highly polluting trunk roads and railway tracks. And this map in the background here is actually the woodland threatened by High Speed 2 Phase 2. And of course, cars are used to ferry children to the forest schools. Lunches are wrapped in materials that will take years to degrade. And dog feces in plastic bags are narrowly avoided by small feet in the forest schools. These are also some of the realities of spending time in woodland. Forest schools are intermeshed and entangled with capitalism, consumerism, and anthropocentrism. Much woodland is heavily managed and under constant threat of further regulation and containment, what Zing terms the Plantationocene. So nature then cannot be thought of as a separate space. Rather, it is intricately, multiply, and non-innocently bound up with capitalism and human-induced destruction. Yet the natural setting of the forest for childhood pedagogy is presented as providing a context that's distinct and divorced in some sense from mainstream classroom-based alternatives. What's interesting, though, is how the curriculum framework, the early years foundation stage in the English context, predominant with ideas about child development and human exceptionism, continue to find expression in forest school pedagogies despite this proclaimed separateness and affinity and connection to nature. So the narrow concern with how nature benefits child well-being, development and learning is precisely what we feel needs to be called to account. What does this anthropocentric logic miss? What else might be possible by bringing the approaches offered by Kimmerer and Simard to the pedagogical and research approaches taken with young children in forest settings if we decenter the child and stop making the forest the context or resource and view it in this more entangled and post-human and indigenous way? Then are there other ways for us to think about relationalities, legacies, histories, and the vital materialism of the forest, and that in turn holds the possibility to inform and shape children's engagements as processes of worldly symbiosis, rather than a narrow and limited focus on human developmental progress. So there are opportunities to materialise the post-human sensibility that works with feminist new materialist and indigenous ontologies to generate practices of world making that directly challenge human exceptionalism in forest settings with children. So what we're proposing here, or what we're working towards, is bringing together Kimmerer, Simard, Janssen, Haraway, Zing, amongst others, to wonder whether it might be both possible and desirable to refuse romanticized stories of the purity and innocence of nature. Instead, what we're proposing is that it's imperative that the inseparability of nature and culture and the ravages of the Capitalocene are taken seriously, so that we might pursue ways to live on a damaged planet. Arboreal methodologies, arboreal methods, we think can help us in this pursuit and involve asking the what else and what if through practices of world making that rest upon gratitude, reciprocity, collaboration, responsibility and worldly justice. Oh, I know I got ahead of myself. So when children enter the forest, it's important to establish a shared understanding that it's not merely a playground. And I think too often, and Suzanne, you had mentioned this in your experiences of working directly with children in forest settings, is that there is this assumption that the forest is there as a playground, as a place of discovery, as a context, as a learning environment. But we would suggest that actually, when you take the framework that we're proposing, the arboreal methodology approach, that actually there's so much more there to discover and ways to attune and be in the forest. And we would suggest that it's more than a context in which to develop resilience and take calculated risks. It's a sort of treasure trove. It's a museum, a gallery, a spiritual dwelling where the liveliness of a wood wide web is unfurling in tree time and the layered stories of hundreds of thousands of years circulate elementally, creating opportunities to explore these propositions and provocations with children, allowing a slowness to descend that sets us all free from the limitations of developmentalist logic and the pursuit of human progress, is what an arboreal pedagogy might just potentiate. So working with children to interrogate uncomfortable histories, interconnections, interdependencies, planetary threats is entirely possible and what we would encourage. So the forest is precisely the space and place for materialised storytelling of colonial land capture, capitalist greed, white supremacy that can be pursued through close encounters with fungi, lichens, seeds and mud. Together we can actively engage in practices of storytelling and world making. So going back to the Moomins and tales in Moomin Valley, which frequently concern terror, drama and adventure, and the fear and threat of getting lost. So as part of this project of developing or attuning to arboreal methodologies, we played with the idea of what getting lost literally, theoretically and methodologically might potentiate. And we were inspired by Patty Lather's book, Getting Lost, Feminist Efforts Towards a Doubled Science, in which she exposes research processes as methodologies sometimes unknown to themselves that stumble and bumble along the way, make mistakes, and lose themselves in the name of science. Taking up her invitation to vulnerability and speculative approaches to research, we draw upon our own situated knowledges and partial perspectives, to follow Haraway, to allow ourselves to get lost. Over to you, Suzanne.
And so getting lost was one of the things that I tried actually experiencing physically. I felt like getting to know the forest involves daring to get lost, to not just stick to what was known, but to really give up control and to surrender to my surroundings and to experience the unknown. It took me a long time before I dared to get lost. I wasn't successful at all. I would go on to unfamiliar paths, but I would kind of naturally seem to veer my way back to knowing where I was again. So the spring equinox last year, I finally decided, okay, this is it. I'm really going for it. And I followed the animal tracks rather than the human paths and kept thinking, okay, each time I come to a fork, I will choose one that feels right. And I kept doing that and I kept doing that. And on that day, there was no sunshine. It was cloudy. And most of the other times I'd been doing it, the sun had been shining. So I kind of knew which direction I was going in. Today, I had no indicators of direction. So I kept walking and walking, and all of a sudden I discovered I was lost. I didn't know where I was. And there was a sense of panic and unease that just consumed me. And I had to remind myself, okay, it's a smallish island. I can't get too lost before I kind of drop off the island or hit a bridge or something. And I have no need to get home for a specific time, but for some unearthly reason, this need to know where I was and need to keep time just became overwhelming. I kept going and tried to find where I was in the forest by following a human path when I found one. And I followed that for a while, but after half an hour, I still had no idea where I was. So I decided I'd use my phone and kind of find on the map. It was cheating. I'd promised myself I wouldn't do it, but the fear and the panic had taken over. And but my phone didn't work. I was too lost for my phone to even work. So I kept following the paths. There was horse trails I was following, there was bike trails I was following, until I finally found a house and a small road, unsurfaced road. And I got myself on the road and my phone worked, and I was so surprised at how far in the wrong direction I had been walking. So I was in the middle of nowhere, got my bearings back again and used the surfaced roads and unsurfaced roads to get back to my house. I didn't kind of dare going back into the forest, even though it would have been much more fun. I was a little bit afraid I'd get lost again just after my phone not working. I eventually got back, even though I didn't need to get back. I realized I should pack snacks next time. My stomach was starting to rumble. And after lunch and my body started relaxing, I realized how energy consuming it had been to have been lost, to have not known where I was, that none of the trees felt familiar, none of the paths felt familiar. And I ended up having to take a nap just to kind of become rearranged with myself again. And I think, this unknown is so kind of consuming of energy. And I think that's where children are. They're in the unknown all the time.
So I kind of took up the invitation to get lost in a slightly different way. So I allowed myself to get lost in memories and hauntings and frustrations, I suppose, about everyday life. And so I'll just recount here some of this haunting memory work. So trees keep me awake at night. I've lost count of the petitions I've signed to save trees the world over. The anger I feel at the injustice facing trees is at times overwhelming. Closer to home, I protest against the national high-speed rail development that is underway, ripping out the heart of the country to enable people to whiz up and down the length of England. But why, I wonder, why the rush? Devastation of ancient woodlands east to west, north to south. We are witnessing the Anthropocene in gory, ruthless overdrive, whilst the nation is prevented from mass protest. Deforestation by stealth, made more possible by a pandemic. Capitalist greed and out of control human exceptionalism. All of this is interwoven. Why are the dots not joined? Even closer to home, the local council is in the process of decimating what's termed the thin green line, a nature reserve that snakes its way across North London from parks to forest. This disused railway line has been central to my urban living, especially as a mother. It has been my companion for well over a decade. The spring that my firstborn arrived, the woodland beckoned me. I bundled my baby into a sling and walked beneath the canopy for hours, settling down to breastfeed, then wandering on, stopping to admire the patterns made by leaves on the ground, whiling away days during a maternity leave when I felt lost, unsure of the right way to be a mother. The trees, the walking, the dappled sunlight, the smells, sounds and sensation of earth underfoot, the beaten path and the less well-trodden invited me in. Safety, calmness. It provided us both with the comfort we needed. His name means rest and comfort, and hers spirit of the forest. These same woods have provided a playground to my children, and many more besides, as they have grown through babyhood to toddlerdom and now into their teenage years. These woods enchant, excite, provoke curiosity, wonder at the changing seasons. To the spawn in the frog pool, the parakeets that escaped London Zoo many years before and can be found in the highest branches, and the tireless thrill of finding a rope swing on a muddy Sunday afternoon, even now. Birthday parties, treasure hunts, darting through the woods, this thin green line and the ancient forest it cuts through matters bodily. It is in our skin, in our memories, in our lungs, on our boots and in our hair. Most recently, as the country, no, the entire world, plunged into lockdown, the woods were there for me once more. I take you to the Sunday morning protest. A funeral procession to mark the unnecessary death of 182 trees to facilitate bridge inspections. Not just trees, hedgerows, nesting birds, not yet hatched insects. An entire ecosystem. Following a frenetic exchange of WhatsApp messages, a group of over 50 activists, children included, is convened. The desolate landscape provides a fitting scene for a funeral procession. Dressed in black with a small brass band to play some sombre music along the 8-mile walk. Felled trees are dragged with us. Some people stop in support, others deride us. What's all the fuss? We needed the extra space to walk safely at a social distance. Lefty lunacy gone mad. Why don't you get yourself a life? I feel the weight of the felled tree that I drag in my arms and shoulders. A bag of dog excrement has become entangled in the branches that has been dragged along too. The march concludes by loading all the felled trees that have accompanied us into a black hearse. A car so accustomed to transporting dead human bodies is charged with delivering this arboreal corpse to the council headquarters, where wreaths are laid and local journalists are on hand to report the scene. So these small stories of getting lost capture affinities and affections, tangles and connections. They are desperate stories, but they are also, we would suggest, hopeful stories. Taking our bodily encounters with the forest as a way to recognise the non-innocence of the woodland and its complex intermeshment with the Anthropocene has offered us opportunities to slow down, to be open to the what else, to make the familiar strange. These stories underline both the insignificance, the smallness of humans, and the limitations of pedagogy, activism, and knowing. Arboreal methodologies, we would suggest, invite a deeper, tentacular engagement with the forest that insists that we stay with the trouble. This modest project of curating arboreal methodologies has taught us the need to be open to getting lost and to take seriously that which agitates discomfort, unease, and uncertainty. Dog feces have resurfaced through this storytelling. They are of the forest and have as much to tell us about human exceptionalism, multi-species hierarchies, and relationalities to children. The dog feces in a biobag tells of responsibility of dog ownership, yet its presence in the forest school and within the activist funeral procession tells other stories. Romanticised accounts of the forest tell of its beauty, serenity, and life-giving properties. But we have responsibility as teachers, mothers, scholars, activists to engage with the non-innocence of human entanglement with the forest and how matter comes to matter. Arboreal methodologies offer a modest means to grapple with our worldly relationalities. The stories that are told must be more confederate, more worldly, and respectful of different knowledge systems. So to conclude, we would say that this process of over a year or more of developing, and I don't think we've arrived at a conclusive arboreal methodology. It's an ongoing practice that's unruly, intricate, and endlessly interwoven and endlessly unfolding. Many times, as you've heard here, we felt lost, and we saw that the promise of being lost, the potential of being stuck and feeling uncertain, dropping the threads and making unexpected patterns. We've pursued paths that have turned back on themselves, and some have stopped altogether. Others have unfurled into places that we could not have anticipated at the start. We have somehow, though, navigated a way through, which has involved delving into many bodies of literature, literal walks through woodland and forest, allowing ourselves to be haunted by other times beneath tree canopy in different places. As we have mobilised theory in attempts to enact arboreal methodologies, we have found that the paths have become obscured with leaves, feathers, twigs, felled trees, dog feces, sweet wrappers, and fungi, or an implosion of what Haraway terms nature cultures, one word, and the associated discomforts. What we had set out to pursue has taken on a different texture, tempo, and orientation that was rarely of our human design. We found ourselves endlessly in the middle, but in search of the beginning. Getting lost was central to the project. Our venturing off the beaten path in terms of writing, undertaking research, and offering something to the field of childhood studies is shaped by feminist new materialist scholarship informed by Indigenous ontologies. Such an approach allows for attunement to the affective intensities that are generated from speculative modes of inquiry, and so affords opportunities to generate knowledge in ways that break free from Western academic convention, and that we find to be very empowering and liberating. The forest walk metaphor we work with is more than mere metaphor. We sought to materialise arboreal methodologies because they deny our human exceptionalism and agitate a series of questions that are at once deeply political but ultimately unanswerable. We contend that the point is not to arrive at a neat set of conclusions about how to undertake research or to write differently, but rather to accept the invitation to immerse fully in the processes involved along the way and what that might have to offer us in terms of pursuing more livable worlds.